I'd always laughed at people who saw ghosts as being insane. I'd made jokes about our friends who claimed that they had psychic powers. And this was the thing which suddenly shocked me into completely reordering my own mental universe.
That's still the most real psychical experience I've ever had.
Is it possible to travel in time? To step through the curtain of our daily life and find ourselves in a totally different time and place? Different scenes, different people, different landscape. It is, of course, the very stuff of science fiction. But could it ever happen in real life? It's a question that has fueled scientific controversy for decades, and indeed it still does. But there are people who would claim to know the answer. It is possible. It has happened to them. One of them is no less a person than the famous psychiatrist and philosopher Carl Jung. In the 1930s, he was traveling through Italy and went to visit the tomb of a Roman empress in Ravenna. In his account of the episode, he describes how he became aware of a strange atmosphere in the place and an unexplained mild blue light everywhere. But what caught his attention was the remarkable beauty of a series of mosaics depicting maritime scenes. He stood in front of them and discussed them with his companion for 20 or 30 minutes. On leaving the mausoleum, they tried to buy postcards of them, but surprisingly, there were none. Later on, he asked a friend visiting Ravenna to obtain pictures for him. It was then that he learned the truth. The mosaics simply did not exist. These are the mosaics that were in the mausoleum at the time of Jung's visit, nothing like the ones he described. The mosaics that Jung and his companion looked at and discussed, infused with that strange pale blue light, had existed once, but then been destroyed by fire several hundred years earlier. Jung came to believe that he had indeed travelled in time and witnessed the building as it was in the time of the Empress herself, fully 1400 years earlier. Mary Rose Barrington is a paranormal investigator who has become deeply involved in these ripples in time, where people seem to walk out of one world into another time and place. She has studied the Jung case in detail and believes there are extraordinary similarities with another case that occurred in this country. It involves the Bartons. They were a couple who ran a famous and much talked about bookshop in the 50s, and who often spent their leisure time walking in the Surrey Hills. On one of these walks, they believe they travelled back in time to another landscape.
Before we left the flat in the morning, I had been extremely depressed and didn't want to go for the walk. And unknown to me, he'd felt the same, but we neither mentioned it. We thought it would just spoil the day.
By some strange compulsion, they still don't understand, they travelled on beyond the spot they had intended and eventually stopped in the village of Wootton Hatch. Once there, they decided to visit the tomb of John Evelyn, the famous 17th century diarist.
We were rather surprised to find the gate of the tomb open, which we'd never found before. And so we looked round that, spent a lot of time investigating the memorials and the inscriptions and all the other bits that make up a very beautiful tomb. And then we left the church, walked down to the gate, and as we came out of the gate, almost immediately, we turned onto a path that was totally overgrown with vegetation. And then we began to climb this path. It was a very narrow path. We had to go single file to go up it. And we climbed up, 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 up. And then we came out at a point, at a clearing with a straight path and a clearing behind it, and wooded trees behind that, and then on the path, along the path, was a seat, a backless seat, and Eric said, "Why don't we sit on this seat? We spent so much time in the church. Let's sit on this seat and have our lunch now." It was now about 10 to 12 o'clock. I could only say that the depression was by now very, very overwhelming. just couldn't eat the sandwiches. And the only comfort came from the sound of a woodman and a dog howling, what it sounded like down in the valley. And as I was crumbling the bread and throwing it to the bird, there was suddenly a total silence. Not one bird was singing. I could still hear the woodchopper and the dog, but that was all. Everything went absolutely still.
Then Elaine, my wife, turned to me and said, "Is it cold?" Cold. It was a very hot day. No, certainly not. And she said, "Feel my arm." And it was icy cold.
And I saw, standing in the clearing behind, 3 men. And I went to turn round to look at them, and I realized I'd seen them through the back of the head. I'd say they were wearing a sort of cape, a black. They were all 3 of them entirely in black. The center one was most definitely a clergyman, because he had a clerical collar on. And he had a smaller rimmed hat. The outer 2 men had a larger black rimmed hat. And I would have said that they were, as I say, late 18th, early 19th century. Looking back on it at the time, of course, you don't think like that. You just see the figures and, or whatever and accept them. You don't say to yourself, "Oh, I'm seeing 3 figures from the 18th or 19th century." You just don't. I have no idea why one would have a visitation of figures from any period at a time like that, and in a place like that, because it was out of place, apart from out of time.
Very disturbed by this forbidding apparition, they hurried on for a while along the lonely path, and then lay down and fell asleep on the edge of a field. They have only a faint recollection of how they eventually made their way back to Dorking Station to get back to London. Eric was so disturbed by the experience that on the following Sunday, he decided to return to Wootton and retrace the path of their walk to unravel exactly what had happened. But it seemed that the landscape they'd walked through no longer existed.
Reaching the church, Evelyn's church, doors were opening and people were coming out.
So he stopped a man who was coming out of the church and said to him, "Are you familiar with this area?" He said, "Yes, indeed, I am." And Eric said, "Well, can you tell me where?" And he described the landscape that we had been in. And this man said, "No, there's nothing like that round here." And Eric said, "Well, all right then, forget the landscape. Where is there a backless seat on the edge of a path?"
When I asked about the benches, there'd been no benches as far... he knew there was no bench in the whole of this area at all. No bench.
So what had happened to the landscape they'd walked through? The path, the park bench, and the valley. Mary Rose Barrington was convinced that the key to this experience lay in the connection with John Evelyn's tomb.
Well, John Evelyn is the gentleman lying in that tomb, and he is famous for having written a diary in the 17th century commenting on political and social situation. And among his diary entries is a reference to 3 gentlemen, one of whom was a priest, and they were all to be executed for treason against the king, and he was very upset about this. And he happens to mention it in a diary entry in the same time as he's talking about having been to the church in Wootton.
The diary entry was for the 15th of March, 1696. And Evelyn wrote of his concern, and I quote, "for 3 unhappy wretches, whereof one is a priest, executed this week for intending to assassinate the king."
So I wondered whether Irina might not have in fact been seeing some landscape initiated through the eyes of Evelyn. in much the same way as the famous psychiatrist C.G. Jung appears once to have got into the mind of a Roman empress when he saw some mosaics.
But nothing in the paranormal is simple and straightforward. Both Irina and Mary Rose Barrington have come up with a second theory. It still involves time travel, but to a different time and place. It seems that on the 19th of July, 1873, Bishop Wilberforce was riding through this very countryside, on his way to Wootton House, indeed, to make up a quarrel with the Evelyn of the time. He was slightly ahead of his two companions when, on this spot, he was thrown from his horse and died. And strangely enough, it has many resemblances to the shape of the landscape through which the Bartons remember walking. So what did Irina witness? Was it the men about to hang that worried Evelyn so much on that March day in 1696? Or was it the sudden dramatic death of the clergyman Wilberforce in 1873? But there is a vital clue, a railway track. The Bartons distinctly remember crossing a single-track railway. In 1954, at the time of their experience, this was a double-track railway, as now. Of course, at the time of Evelyn's diary, there was no railway at all. But in 1873, the time of Wilberforce's death, it would have been a single-track railway. But as we've said, nothing in the paranormal is simple. By visiting Evelyn's tomb, could the Bartons have linked the two events in some extraordinary way?
What these two things have in common is the priest. Therefore, I think they switched from the priest in the Evelyn story to the priest Wilberforce, raking through the centuries, so that there was a fusion of landscapes.
So, in their walk through the woods on that still midsummer's day, did the Bartons skate through time, experiencing both Evelyn's concern for the three men and Bishop Wilberforce's sudden death, before returning, in a way they still can't explain, back to the present time? Nearly 900 years to 1103. That was when the monks of Cluny founded the priory here at Thetford in Norfolk. For hundreds of years, this priory was a place of refuge and pilgrimage. During the Middle Ages, people flocked here because of its reputation for healing and miracle cures. Just 9 years ago, 4 young students, who came here quite by chance, believed they witnessed the priory as it was, hundreds of years ago.
The whole thing was emotional. It was more threatening, the entire place, than the figure. As you said before, the apparition was not that important. It was the emotion. The entire place was scary. The entire place over in that part of the priory anyway. That was the scary thing. I just had to leave the area. And even that night, I was scared. And then for a few nights afterwards, I had trouble sleep.
Those 4 students have returned to Thetford to describe their extraordinary time travel experience, an event which has had a profound effect upon all of them. 3 of them now pursue scientific careers concerned with the understanding of consciousness and the workings of the mind. Their experience happened late one summer's evening as the 4 were passing through Thetford on their way home.
So we pulled into the car park and wandered through, and it was a very pleasant, mild August night. As we walked through, we joked, made silly comments, but we also were fairly serious, keeping an eye open for the history of the place and wondering why we'd never come across it. Something else struck us, which was there was no one here. We would have expected, it's in the middle of a built-up area, in the middle of a town, we'd have expected children, people walking their dogs, people sitting drinking out of bottles. No one. Very lonely place. Eventually we wandered, splitting up on the way, and gathered again at about this point. And while we were standing here, we were looking at the facade of the building in front of us, and through the small window, or 3 small windows, just up here, one of us drew attention to someone watching us. And then a few moments later, the person we saw pass across and come down through a staircase. Now, I wish to stress this, I know it's hard to believe, there was a staircase leading up through that archway to a doorway which you can't see but which is in the ruin behind. And so we saw someone coming down the stairs, and somebody remarked, it's someone wearing a black sheet, it's a joker trying to scare us, they're trying to pretend they're a ghost. And one of us began to walk forwards on the left, and in fact slowly increased his speed as he got closer and closer, and the figure began to retreat back up the stairs, at which point I shouted, "Let's get him," and began to run like this, walking through. I came running in. As I ran in, I tried to run up the staircase. I had the impression that I actually went a couple of stairs up the staircase towards the door above us. The figure had by that time retreated back across. Darren came in on my left, and as he came in, he also ran up the stairs. I fell forward, pitched, struck my head probably about here on the flint wall. Darren also struck himself, though he ran through almost to the back wall. We both ended up on the ground, and I was bleeding. It took us a few seconds to get back up and to look at one another and to realise that there was no staircase, that not only was the figure not real, but neither was the actual staircase which we had physically attempted to run up. At that moment, everything just went cold for me. I got up, Darren was already out, running back towards the car. I staggered back out, joined up with Axel, and we ran. We just ran in sheer fear. And I was questioning my sanity and everybody else's around me at that point. I really didn't understand at all what was going on.
None of them had had any previous paranormal experiences, but being scientifically inclined, they all agreed to go off and write down exactly what they'd seen independently of one another. Much of what follows is taken from those accounts.
Right, this is my account of the vision. It appeared to be a man about 5.5 foot tall, judging from how high he appeared to be relative to the archway. And he was wearing a black monk's habit in the sort of Dominican style, with the cowl pulled up and his hands clasped within his sleeves in this kind of a position, which meant that none of his skin or anything was visible in the light at all. It just was black with possibly darker face. You know, that's what I saw.
We advanced towards the steps that we could see that the figure was standing on. I felt nervous, but I was so curious that I had to continue. We walked towards the steps, and as we approached the archway, I was still convinced the steps were there. The figure had gone, disappeared, presumably up the stairs. I tried to walk up the stairs, but they weren't there. I just fell over. That's when I got up and ran.
It's odd actually, because my drawing doesn't look much like a cowled monk. What I drew and I wrote at the time was, it looks like a person wearing a black sheet or a woman in 18th century dress. And the reason I had the impression of the 18th century dress was it seemed to be flowing towards the bottom. I do agree that the arms were folded across. And also I noticed there were some dark points, almost glittering like coal, black coal broken, in the central area here, which I recorded on my drawing, which you can see in my statement.
The doorway seemed to be much darker than it should be, and then there was a cloud, smoke or something, which sort of grew and became bright. I didn't actually see a figure, I just saw a column of smoke glowing and slowly becoming bigger, and basically that's when I panicked and fled.
From these accounts, it's clear that all four witnessed a strange and inexplicable event, and it triggered off in all four a profound interest in the science of the paranormal, in an effort to come to terms with their experience.
The environment has triggered something in us, and we all see it in our own minds. I mean, I don't think that invalidates it just because
you see an individual perception of it.
Just because I saw a column of smoke, you saw an individual, you saw someone in a habit. That's all maybe the emotions that have been taken at that time.
Well, I suppose that when you think about it, there are various explanations you could offer beyond the ones we've talked about. The idea it's a recording of the dead abbot or prior, wasn't it? It's a recording of him reenacting, or possibly because we had the feeling of the priory being more real as we left it, as if it was coming into existence around us, or somehow very close.
Certainly.
Time slip? I don't know.
But the physical thing to me was the staircase. I mean, I can't think of any reasonable explanation for that. It's not a ghost, it's an inanimate object.
But if you have a ghost of a man on a horse, you have to have the horse. And if you have a ghost of a horse and carriage, you have to have the carriage. The carriage doesn't have to have a soul or a spirit, but it still appears. And therefore the ghost on the stairs wouldn't have made sense unless we'd seen the stairs. So that the stairs might have even been added by our own minds to explain how the figure was coming down. We actually sort of did the window dressing for the experience we were having. Axel, what did you think about the place becoming more real as we left?
I wouldn't have said it would be caused just by the fear, because it was a lot more. Because it's not an imposing place.
Well, no,
it's not something I'd find imposing.
But it seemed it at the time.
Yeah, and I think that was possibly due to the kind of the time slip theory does account for that a lot more effectively. Just the fact that we were being.
As if we were partially slipping back.
That's right. Yeah.
We were closer than.
Yeah, as if we're much closer to this the time period when it happened, when it was a functioning abbey, or priory rather.
There's the Wootton time slip. There are various famous cases, but in many of those, people experienced a dreamlike state, an altered state of consciousness, and often felt depressed. The two ladies who had the...
This event has had a powerful effect on the shape of Chris's life. He is now involved in research into the nature of consciousness. He's also spent some time digging into the history of Thetford, and he's come up with a murder story.
What actually happened was in the late 14th century, a prior who was actually, that is the prior's quarters, the building where we saw it, and there was actually historically a staircase going up at that location. And the prior was murdered by one of his monks, who was from France, who he had refused permission to return to his home territory, so to speak. And the monk repeatedly stabbed the prior in the stomach and chest. And after the death of the prior, within the prior's quarters, the monk was taken to Norwich Castle, where he was branded, his eyes were put out, and he was incarcerated for the rest of his life in a dungeon under Norwich Castle. This is a matter of historical record. We actually found this out after you'd left.
Oh, right.
When we actually went to the library and conducted research. But we didn't know that at the time, and that information was only available, as far as we've been able to find out, in a late 19th century book on the history of Thetford, which has a small reference to it. So it's not a popularly known fact. So there's no way we could have heard that information, forgotten about it, and then later on we could have reinterpreted it because we suddenly realised we were in the right location for the story.
Is it possible to travel in time? That was the question we started with. No one would claim that these events provide a complete answer to that question. They do suggest that time is by no means as simple as the relentless onward ticking of the clock would have us believe. There are, it seems, ripples and discontinuities in time, parallel existences running alongside our own. It would seem possible for any one of us to turn a corner or pass through a door and suddenly find ourselves in a strange and alien world.